heard a bit about social network from Jerry, and isn't he a great advert for why we kept Scotland in the Union? You know, we need people like Jerry in the UK. But seriously, you know, if you look at social networking and the kind of immense power of the social network, you're now seeing it doing remarkable things. The umbrella revolution and the impact of this in terms of both our psychology, the bombardment, and what it's doing to society is quite remarkable, isn't it? I mean, you look at the Mideast, you look at Hong Kong, and we are seeing a remarkable change away from AK-47s for some countries towards Twitter and Facebook. And people who are using social media begin to tell me that privacy is no longer an issue. They're sharing their most intimate thoughts, they're sharing what they want to buy in a shop, they're sharing all sorts of things. And we have found the most remarkable website, which I think proves the case in point. One of the most interesting ones I've come across is ijustmadelove.com. I promise you, it is real. And we kind of trying to do a survey at the moment about how Worktech is influencing the city that it's hosting, their kind of amorous nature. So this is a shot in London. And you can see that there were 340 people the night before the last Worktech there who admitted and shared the idea that they'd just made love. We went then, of course, here to Melbourne, only 67 people, I'm afraid to say. For the Australians in the audience, it wasn't particularly successful. Berlin wasn't too bad, 121 the night before Worktech. Madrid was a staggering 346. The Spanish, you know, and so what do you think San Francisco was last night? Higher or lower than Madrid? Higher, lower. What do we think? It was a little bit lower, I'm afraid to say. So Worktech hasn't yet had the impact we have here. 257 people admitted last night live out of 1/3 people. And they're sharing very intimate detail of what is going on. So now, if you think privacy's dead, you know, so what is happening? Well, our Dutch friends are saying, well, look, let's build on this and let's kind of change the way we interact. And on an aeroplane with KLM, you can now select your seat, not just by aisle or window, but hey, who you know on Facebook or who you'd like to know on Facebook who's on the same flight. And if they let you, you can sit next to each other or LinkedIn. So we're now seeing real networks changing physical space. It'll start with airlines. I think it'll next come into workplaces. And this is a map of who's emailing who inside the office. So for the first time ever, you can move away from this, the kind of hierarchy, and instead go to this, which is the real network and the real work that's taking place. So if those red dots have got something in common, let's say Agile Scrum we heard about earlier from Chris, you can identify them live, you can watch them form, and you can say, hey, I'll accommodate them, those 30 people, in a space, and make their work faster and better. And this builds on Stephen Johnson, who addressed Worktech here on the West Coast 3 years ago, which is a brilliant construct where he kind of predicts the adjacent possible, the need for people to kind of be together to interact and achieve innovation. And that's the kind of flies in the face of this, isn't it? That's how we normally plan offices, the sedentary history of how the corporation is structured. And that's been the predominant model of saying, let's accommodate each floor based on that. And that's very different to the slides I've just shown you. And what we predict is that this will happen physically as well. We think that physical buildings will begin to accommodate, as the KLM are doing. And so this is an incredible space that Macquarie Bank developed in London. It was a standard building. They ripped out 10 floors and put this amazing staircase in, designed by Clive Wilkinson here in California. But you can see the beginning of what is Jelly Bean working. You can see the LinkedIn overlaid onto the architecture alongside the Jelly Bean. Now, what does that mean? Well, I showed Mark this the other day. I mean, this is an American company called Relationship Science, RELSI. And RELSI is a remarkable growth area. What RELSI is saying is that they can map relationships globally without anybody adding any information. So this is kind of profiled from the web and other sources. So Greg Lindsay, who's a Worktech keynote, I said to Greg, if I wanted to get to Reid Hoffman, how could I do it? And he's a obviously pioneer here in the Valley. Well, it's actually just two kind of links. You can just call up Mark, who's here, and say, hey, Mark, you know Reid, can you introduce me? Or you could go via Craig and Jeffrey and get to him in 2 steps. And the way that that will work, we think will come into the office. And this then collides with something else going on inside offices, which is about navigation and wayfinding, the building reacting to people as they move through the physical space. And this is coming very quickly. Again, Ben Weber, who's keynoted Worktechs, has got a company called Sociometric Solutions, which is tracking people, those green dots on the floor plate, live in real time with the kind of badge they wear around their necks, and then playing back their performance, individual and team, not just based on where they've been and who they've interacted with, but also what they've been saying, because it listens to conversations. Is that Big Brother or what? And you know, Facebook recently saying we're now listening. You know, we are using your mobile smart device to listen to what you're watching on television. So Jerry's light bulbs are going to get worse because they're going to start kind of bombarding him with stuff based on his listening habits, because the microphone is hearing what you're doing, what you're listening to, what you're saying, and so on. But it's useful because of this. You know, the strive for innovation is what every organization wants. And therefore, going back to the idea that Jerry mentioned, of the idea of a driverless car, how does this link in? And the image down there is what the car sees as it navigates the roads here in the valley in San Francisco. And on the racetracks, you can see the equipment they've embedded in these cars. Now, we predict this will come into the office. So we think the kind of same sensing technology will end up being used by people. There's a couple of problems today, as you can imagine, but you know, very soon it'll be this, obviously. We're well aware of what's coming. And when you look at the miniaturization of what's inside a smartphone, when you unbundle it, the killers are the kind of barometer, the gyrometer, and the accelerometer. Those three small miniature devices which are on that image. And of course, that's where we're heading. And that's what will lead to this other phenomena which will collide with jelly beans, called the Internet of Things. IoT. You've had the Internet of People so far, IOP. We now have IoT. And everyone is predicting this to explode in the next 5 years. And there are numerous technologies behind it, really fascinating things coming through. It's about kind of almost unconscious mapping of how people use physical space. That's what's really going on with the Internet of Things. And you can begin to do quite clever stuff with this. In Singapore, there's a workplace now where you get your smartphone out, as you heard a bit from Steve at Motorola. It tells you where you're standing in the office. It tells you what desks or rooms are free. You can then check in just by touch with a technology called Near Field Communication, NFC, and then you can see where your colleagues are. And you can watch your colleagues moving around the workplace. But even more interestingly, it doesn't just show the individual, it shows what they're tweeting or what they're putting onto Yammer at the same time. So you're doing a mashup in the office, in real time, with your colleagues based on what they're actually doing through social and knowledge networks. And what that will soon do is, if I'm on a Yammer feed, it will say, hey, you must go and talk to Peter, because he's been on the same Yammer feed. He's on 2 floors down. So the building will engineer the encounters for the future. And Apple's launch, of course, of iPhone 6 and iOS 8 with NFC built in to enable Apple Pay is just the beginning of this. And their vision of HomeKit, which is the kind of automated home, I think we'll soon have an office kit coming as well. And this then borrows on retail that's really pioneering this. You know, you walk into a store, you get a coupon sent to you based on who you are. And the idea of the iBeacon, which is now again part of the Apple ecosystem, means that people walking into physical space are identified and they can be interacted with. You can imagine the reception area of tomorrow. You walk into a building, your receptionist gets a screen pop on her tablet or his tablet and walks up to you, greets you by name and takes you in a much more exciting experience based on your profile. And this will happen very quickly to lead us to this idea that, you know, Buckminster Fuller created a long time ago of a kind of a bubble of digital connectivity, which is ubiquitous, and you're always on, always connected. The device you use or change with is irrelevant, because whatever device you use, it will just obviously feed from the cloud. And therefore, what we're seeing with the jelly bean is that the icon, this is the idea of the jelly bean, the presence icon, the little dot or the color against your name, will appear on any device, in any software, in real time, across any platform. And that's where the jelly bean is going to go. It's going to come from the state you have at the moment, which is fairly basic. You know, I'm in a meeting, I'm busy, I'm out of the office. That's the kind of primitive version. But quite soon, it'll start appearing in other applications. It'll be a presence server or a jelly bean server will begin to appear in organizations, and it'll be accessed by other organizations. If you're a law firm, your client will have access to your presence server, and they'll know if you're available. So professionals have got a huge shock coming because their clients will have free access to their jelly bean. And what you're going to see next is the idea that when you start co-authoring documents, it will show your jelly bean in real time across every software package you can imagine. So here in Word, you can see that there are 2 documents being co-authored. On the right, Terry and David are both working on the design proposal. On the left, I think that's Sarah and Jonathan working on the overview. Sarah's got a red jelly bean, whereas the others are all in green. And that tells you the state they're in and what they want in terms of the way you connect with them. And that will be ubiquitous across all devices. And you'll begin to kind of have this array of colors, and you'll have to pick kind of, you know, what color will your jelly bean be? And it will change color based on who you are, what you're doing, where you are, and the killer will be what's called contextualized presence or jelly beans. And I'll come on to that. So therefore, the future we're seeing is just a screen, a window to the cloud. And that will get bigger and bigger. And we think that the killer for that window will be visualization of data. So the idea of the Internet of Things, of the Internet of People, what I've shown you so far, it'll all be about data visualization going forwards, how you can manipulate data to make smart decisions very quickly. And we're seeing this. This is a bank. It's a social media command center, a focused room for instant action globally around social media, and a phenomenal application of kind of the jelly bean concept. And here in Asia, the idea that you can break barriers in terms of distance and interact, where the jelly bean becomes actually kind of almost virtual and physical, as well as this kind of technology tool. And we see jelly bean spaces being very different. The kind of dead meeting room will move towards a really dynamic space. And you'll find people doing much more with new technologies like Link, which is kind of very in tune with this idea of the jelly bean. And we think that the presence indicator, the jelly bean color, will be built into furniture and other things very quickly. So the actual display will show people their state. So what does this mean for the future of work? Well, we would predict that the idea of the jelly bean will end up being physical as well. We think we're going to get physical spaces that represent or embody this idea of being connected and showing your presence by behaviors and technology. And I'm seeing some quite interesting examples in the research for the next book of companies doing some remarkable things with their workspaces. This is Commonwealth Bank of Australia. It's their new headquarters in Sydney. It's 5,000 people in a main global bank. Not a single person has any fixed desk, cube, or office. They all carry a wireless MacBook Air, and they're all using the space to interact and move in a very different way. And they're providing something which is very different, because it's about not just choice of space, but about knowing that you don't have to see people or find people in traditional ways, because the jelly bean replaces this issue of where are my colleagues, how do I know someone's working, and all the distrust or mistrust that's come from activity-based mobility inside and outside buildings. Another one that I think is a real example of this is National Australia Bank's new building, this one in Melbourne. This was a 13,000 people migration and adoption of a new way of working. And again, the building is, I think, a kind of representation of this new era, because the entire ground floor is open. There is no security. You can come in. There are co-working environments. There are cafes, baristas. There's a bank branch. But this is a headquarters building for a major global bank. And as you go up through the building, the architecture of this, I think, has been almost created to kind of embody this idea of a fluid organization, of movement, of teaming, of transparency, and so on. People still have anchor points. You have kind of identified areas for teams and clusters and communities. But by and large, you've got a society inside a real estate envelope that is very, very different. And on the ground, this idea of the village, this idea of opening up co-work to be part of the corporate entity is a really interesting idea, bringing clients in to kind of cohabit and innovate with you. I'm seeing the idea of activating buildings then in very different guises. Here's a building back in Australia again, where you take a couple of levels and you can begin to activate a building by actually showing you that the tenants can use new facilities that are not in a tenanted space. And again, how do you manage those? How do you make them real? And what does this mean for the ability for a building to be actuated and very different in the future? And it borrows some of the other early success stories, like Macquarie Bank's building here, which was one of the pioneers in, I think, activity-based settings and spaces. And also then if you go around the world, you're seeing this amazing set of examples. You know, back to the one I used earlier to show you this physical jelly bean. You know, ripping out 10 floors and putting in this incredible structure means it's about people and no longer about physical spaces. And the investment in that is extreme. And then you go to somewhere like here, Unilever in Singapore, and you begin to see that you can actually create not just a kind of a flexible and adaptable workspace, but one that represents their brands, a narrative workspace, as we'd call it. So you say to people, look, I'm going to be in the Ben & Jerry's parlour. I'm working in Ben & Jerry's today. And it's a real Ben & Jerry's ice cream parlour, because Unilever owns that brand. Or you might go to the Lipton's Cafe. So what we're seeing now is a kind of more interesting narrative coming into offices, because you're free to be easier to choose your setting. And the narrative goes all over the world. Vodafone here in Amsterdam, employing some really remarkable ideas for their future offices, borrowing on their own experiences, their own customers, building train carriages, because that's where their customers work. So let's put it back into their own offices to have that experience. Here, an insurance company using one of the top designers in the world, Marcel Wanders, to kind of create these stone huts, actually built in Glasgow, sent to Holland, but remarkable structures for future work. And finally, the BBC here in Manchester, adopting a radical approach to their portfolio, massive cost savings, changing the nature of the way they work. But the most exciting was for this, is removing the need for huge capital expenditure spaces, i.e. the studios, and placing those in a block next door to their workspace, owned and operated by somebody else. So this kind of juxtaposition where the jelly bean kind of dissolves the need for distance and removes that barrier of knowing where people are, how to find them, how to create the clusters and communities is kind of becoming real and tangible, I think, for many organizations around the world. So that's the introduction to the jelly bean. It's kind of taking the presence icon that we have today in Skype and other services and extending it. It'll be ubiquitous, it will follow us. What interests me in the labs I've seen is that it will just be more than colleagues. It'll be anyone. If you read an article on a tablet, the author of that article will also have a jelly bean. And if that author likes what you are saying or thinking about the article, they may change their jelly bean color and let you interact with them. So you'll begin to find any kind of information can be live in real time. You'll no longer read dead offline information. The jelly bean will make it tangible, synchronous, and you can interact with it or the person that's created it in very, very different ways for the future. And that's the BBC again. The last concept, of course, is about people. And we are now in an era of food, wellness. We've touched on food earlier on. I love what Google is doing in Mountain View with their food. The idea that you've got this idea of good feedback, you can touch your phone, rate your food, and all the rest of it. And I'm seeing that as the next big boundary of innovation. Here in Australia, Bupa are doing some remarkable measures from healthy vending machines to using this incredible inclinometer to look at how sit-stand burns calories, how you create a healthy workplace, how it measures well-being and wellness of people within the workplace. So as we break for lunch, think about that. Stand up, burn some calories, have some food, and remember what color your jelly bean is. Thank you very much.